Welcome to Saving UX. I'm your host, Jeremy Kriegel. I believe UX is struggling. Look, there are more people doing the work now than at any time in our past, and every company says they're customer focused. So why does it feel so hard? I don't mean the work. The work can be hard. That's okay. Why does it feel like we have to fight to do the things that will benefit the people we serve and the organizations we work with? I've been in this fight for more than 25 years, and I believe it is worth fighting for. Now, every week I talk to UX veterans about the challenges facing our practice and what we can do to make it better. This week, I'm joined by Dr. Gloria O.B. Osardu, the Global Head of Experience Research and Insights at Gusto. Gloria, thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
I'm looking forward to this. For folks who might not be familiar with you and your work, could you give us maybe a bit of a brief background on a little bit of your history, how you got into UX and where you are now?
Yes, so I call myself a computer scientist turned UX researcher, and I actually came into industry research through academia. Started off in computer science, always thought I was going to be a software engineer. But I felt like my love for designing what the code looks like and really figuring out what is it that I want the outcome to look like was what drove me to building awesome codes in gaming and entertainment. Um, and that led me back then, there was nothing called UX research. It was just usability and making sure that, your code was sound, people were able to use your game or the thing that you built. And so I went through that path to investigate how to build great code, went into healthcare IT, building technology for healthcare, and then went into academia. That was where we're starting to do the human computer interaction, talking about robotics, how we engage with technology, and then frankly, learning much of what I know now about design in there. We did graphic, we did all types of design. But then the core psychological and cognition theory around how people behave when they're introduced to new technology was where I learned the craft. So academia, and then as life will have it, had to randomly move because my husband is in medicine. And then I got a job in industry. So the last 10 or so years have been in, tech industries from banking to cloud solutions. And now I have settled in startup Gusto, which is a payroll platform.
It's quite a journey. Gaming, healthcare, HR, AWS, financial services. As you look back through those experiences from where you are now, how would you describe the current state of UX? What's working? Where are we experiencing challenges?
As I look back, the first thing is to be so, I think for me, it's just being amazed. I tell the story that even when I was defending my thesis, which was a combination of UX research, design, thinking about healthcare, I did not get faculty members who could understand the gravity of UX in technology building or like in changing adoption and implementation. Can you imagine that? So it's until recently that we found out that design and UX is not in isolation and we can actually apply it to a lot of the ways that we think about technology or the way that we build. And so for me, I look back and I'm like, wow, we've come a long way. Like nobody could have told me how much UX was going to be a thing post the pandemic or in 2022. But with all that being said, I think some of the greatest challenges, like with fast growth, we are starting to experience root pains, right? Um, we are starting to see folks that came through, the academic doors, folks that are coming through boot camps and training, folks that are actually in roles that were more like product or investigation, and started to see the importance of UX. And so now transition into UX and learn on the job. And I think our core area that is starting to threaten like UX is how do we manage such great need from the industry for UX professionals and balance that with the support that we're given, like whether it's designers or content designers or UX researchers. I think there's a gap there, and nobody has figured it because I say this that we are on a train, the train is moving, but we're also building the tracks. So nobody is stopping to say, like, what do we need to get folks to understand, like, what's going on, and not just think about getting into the roles and delivering, like, whether it's design or research. I think there's a gap with that talent management and that continuity of growth in the space that we find ourselves right now.
That's an interesting. Can you talk about that dichotomy? I mean, you are at the highest level of academic training with a PhD. Very few people in our field have a PhD. So congrats on that. That's
Thank
amazing.
you. Yes.
And you're talking about, we have all these new people coming up, going to these little tiny boot camps. So as you're building practices and you're leading teams, how do you look at that gap, whether in terms of ways that we can help close it from an industry perspective, and or maybe ways that you kind of adapt your coaching and mentoring to help grow people who aren't coming from the depth of experience that you've come from?
Yeah. So I love that, folks are starting to come from all the different areas because I firmly believe that UX can really be effective if the folks that are doing it, the folks that are championing what we need to do are representative of, like, the users and the customers and people that use technology. I've been in so many, leadership roles where, like, everybody wants a senior designer, everyone wants a senior researcher. And so for me, I think that the gap is not, where people get the training. The gap is, like, how do we provide this sustainable ecosystem driven community where with the one head count that I have, like, I have the opportunity to hire, interns and apprentices and people that would need that chance to be in a group to learn more. Like, my biggest fear, and this is what I want to talk about in terms of, like, saving UX, is we have the veterans retiring. Like, I know so many amazing researchers and designers, and they have been in the industry for so long, starting from all the way back to usability phase, right? And you get into a space where they're either solo consultants because, like, it's just so messy, or they are getting to a space where they're getting ready to retire. And so when you think about the need for UX professionals that has become really big, but then opportunities that are either, like, really narrowed or really traditional, how do we ensure that leaders or even teams or companies have these safe space for folks to come in and learn without the burden of, like, okay, I need one UX designer or one researcher to come in and literally save a product or interface or service. That's my biggest concern.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I've felt that tension. Curious to hear your perspective, but you want to hire junior people to help mentor them, but mentoring them takes time. And if you're already
Yes.
understaffed, you don't have the time to help grow the people that you need to grow your practice. So then you're relying
Yeah.
on those senior people, which is, as you said, maybe a dwindling
Mhm.
pool. Have you
Yeah.
been successful in, I guess, maybe helping leadership understand that challenge and to be able to give you the resources necessary to grow less experienced practitioners?
So it depends. In the places that I've been with, like, bigger design teams, we're starting to see that companies are starting to increase the numbers, and people are starting to understand that the same way that we have programs for engineering interns or engineering folks and product folks, we're starting to have these opportunities for design and research. But I think that the biggest area that we started to see, even during the pandemic, was the introduction of apprenticeship programs. I was at Amazon when we kicked off that initiative, and we saw so many applicants try to get their foot in the door. Now, that is amazing because we saw a lot of companies do that, not just Amazon, which was great. And so they come in, they do the training. It's so competitive. So you get to, kind of hire the cream of the cream of, like, who wants to get into the space. But then transitioning them into the teams which are already understaffed, right? And transitioning them into spaces where we ensure that they have the mentorship going on, they have, someone to give them that positive feedback, they have opportunities to fail fast and learn from it. I'm not sure we got it to that point where we can afford those things. And so as teams get bigger and UX starts to be more prominent in companies, I don't know quite yet when we can get to the point where we're like, okay, we have interns coming in, we have the support model for them, and we are not letting them into like a role that is either too horizontal or the scope is too wide for them to just feel like they can fail fast.
Now, I mean, Gusto being a startup, do you have more latitude to determine
Oh,
how you're going to build your practice?
yes. So that was one of the main things that drove me to Gusto. Gusto is a people platform, and we are on a mission to really transform the way that small business owners think about payroll, HR benefits. And so the company is it's small and it's a unique opportunity to really start to build from the ground out what design should look like. When I took the job, one thing that was clear is he understood the value. And so for a startup to invest so much in UX was just a good sign. And so when I joined, some of the things I did was first raise my hand. We need a research intern. We had design interns, but also the bulk of the work is to just establish what UX looks like for companies. And you know design is starting to get forefront of like in our HR practices and the way we think about career growth and the way that we think about where UX should be represented, whether it's conversations, how we work, team dynamics. A lot of teams are being introduced. And so fixing or really starting to craft that narrative, right? How should we work? We just got a designer, or how should we work with this researcher who just joined the team? Are things that we really build from the ground up. And so it's exciting. And we, with a little team, we have an intern coming in, right? So these are the opportunities that we start to create, and I think it's not just good practice for the team, but also for the senior researchers and designers on the team. They get to give back, get to understand what it means to kind of look back and hold up someone who is probably trying to get some experience in the way that they drive impact to their work. So that are ways like, raising your hand to say, I want an intern, doing the work in terms of thinking about roles and guidelines around growth. And the other thing, Jeremy, that I see is that a lot of folks will apply for the roles and they talk about, I want to be on a team. Like, I don't know if you've seen that or you've heard that,
Yeah.
but designers and researchers are starting to gravitate towards teams and companies that have UX teams and resources, and get to have that relationship with other, whether it's researchers or designers, do those critique sessions and design reviews, get to be part of a community. That's something that I'm starting to see a lot. And people are coming from all different roles to get into companies that have larger UX teams.
And certainly it was instrumental in my growth when I was coming
Yeah.
up. I started by kind of hacking a little agency together in college, knew enough that I had no idea what I was doing, and then went to work at Xerox. And Xerox
Yeah.
had this huge team, and there'd be these crits with 20 plus people, some of whom had been designing since punch cards. And so you had this real depth of knowledge, like you were talking about, people who've just been doing it for a long time. So being able to hear how they talked about their work and the questions they asked other people and the conversations between them I thought that was huge for me early on in my career. And I'm seeing this not just from junior designers, but even I've seen some senior people who are going, I've
Yes.
been independent for a long time and I miss that team. I want to get back into
Yeah.
working with a team. So I think, yeah, you're right. You're hitting on a real need
Yeah.
there. So I'm also curious obviously you're going to have constraints, and startup constraints are different than big company constraints. But as you look kind of imagine the vision of the practice you'd like to build. What are the things that you've experienced in the past that you would keep? Like, that was good, worked really well, I want to bring that in. And what maybe are the experiments that you want to try, things you want to do differently, based on other experiences?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. And I think about that a lot because I want the practice and the teams that I'm building to not just be highly effective, but I want the teams and the practice to also be impactful. Like, it's not just setting up a research or UX team because, like, now design is a thing. And if your company doesn't have a UX team, like, it's just like, what are you trying to do? But I think that some of the things that I want to keep is the ability for UX to really identify the core crafts and the UX, right? I have been in situations like when I started my career where you are the single person UX team or you a consultant, you do everything. I think that in order to facilitate like really craft honing techniques or like development or really thinking about what the problem is and what tool we need to solve all these problems. We need to start to encourage that, separation of craft. So, at Gusto and so many places we have, content designers, we have product designers, we have experienced researchers, we have, design ops, research ops. And I think even for research, one thing that I want to do further from companies that have been with large teams is start to also break that apart into quant researchers and qual researchers and researchers that are more of like, okay, I can talk about the abstract and how to get to think through concepts. I think that's something that we don't start to think deeply about. We think that, oh, what are the skills that you have as a UX person? You're a designer, you're a researcher. But even if you're a designer, what are the sub skill sets that you want to hone in on? If you're a researcher, what are the sub skill sets that you want to hone in on? I also want to keep the relationship, the allyship that research has with design. I know UX is that broad umbrella, term for the group, but as we're starting to really think of like, chief design officers would hire head of design or you'd have some form of relationship. It's not only reporting structure or business kind of goals to just check off. I think that there's some form of allyship that happens that is magical when design really, supports and helps research grow, or research help with design, whether it's testing or concept or things that you're trying to do. That relationship is magical, and I want to keep that and actually love that. When we think about research and design, we have started to emphasize on cross-functional collaboration. Like, that's the key. You need to be able to work with, if you're a researcher, you should be able to work with designers and engineers and PM. If you're a designer, you should be able to work with a researcher or do some basic form of research and engineers and PMs. And I think the one thing that I really loved about the startup and joining Gusto is it is so collaborative that the research and design, the UX org is collaborating not just with engineers and PMs, but with marketing and sales and customer support. And that is just like a treasure trove for research because you get to see the data that is coming from data science, the data that is coming from customer support, the data that is coming from marketing insights, and you get to facilitate that conversation, right? One thing that I would like to not keep is research sitting in a particular function. And this has forced me to go back and forth several times of like, do I want to create a research insights lab, which is this incubator group that starts to tackle like hardcore questions about a product or about a way that the business wants to move to? Because we're starting to see that the questions that are coming up, whether it's like core foundational design experience problems or core business product problems, is not really define in terms of like design research versus product research. And so for research, as we're trying to figure out like how do we make the most out of the resources that we have, which is not a lot, is to really rethink the way that we support teams or large scale problem areas without burnout or without thinking that like we just need to do it all at the same time. I have conversations with other research leaders, and it's just like you're either doing the intake model where like everything comes, you triage it and you take on, but that we know that doesn't support career growth. Like you're just spreading yourself and there's no continuity. Teams don't benefit from legacy knowledge and all of that. And others have also started to think about, having a lab that doesn't do much of tactical design research or doesn't do much of like generative, but also think about where does the company want to go in a year or two, and how do we start answering those questions before they get ready for the product team. So those are some things that I want to start doing because I don't want to keep the way that we've thought about research or design. And I am happy to say that we're starting to see a lot of like UX folks sit into C suites, like to really be part of the conversation. One last thing that I don't want to keep, and I'm starting to change that narrative, is that isolation of UX. Like work that UX does traditionally have been thought about as like the icing on the cake, in the sense that, we have built our product, we know the market, we have done everything, and now we just have to build an experience, which in a sense is just the interface, right? Or the interaction. Or when there's a huge gap with the experience that we have on like a point of sale or something that is draining, bottom line, like that's where we're calling UX. I think that's not the right approach. And I would not like to keep that approach of like having UX be the last thing before like a company feels that they've arrived. I think UX, which is design and research, should really think about foundational experiences. And I think Gusto is doing it right, starting from how little they are and starting to infuse design and experience research. And so I want to start to sprint ahead of product teams and sprint ahead of design, even when we start to see something that we should build our design solution options. So that sprinting ahead is also a blessing and a curse in disguise, because then folks will like to think about like things that are happening in the moment, right? And so how do you condition them to think about the future before they see it? And those are some of the big challenges with like UX right now.
So I don't know if you're able to let us in on some of those conversations, because I think it's an important topic that not
Yeah.
only just in startups and others, where I think a lot of stakeholders do believe that they understand the market and they know what they need to build. And yeah, UX gets relegated to the latter part of the process where we can't really quite have the depth of impact that we'd like. I don't know whether with Gus or anyone else, I don't know if there's a
Yeah.
way that you've approached it where you felt you've been able to help shift people's perspective. I don't know, just curious what those conversations have looked like for you.
Yes, so those conversations always start with, the people relationship. For me, I know that folks have traditional ways that they've seen UX or, design and research, the ways that has worked for them in the past. And so I think that conversation always like, suddenly starts from those one-on-ones and building those core relationship and understanding the fears and the frustration and the excitement of product teams or engineering teams. We always hear this from big tech companies or big companies where it's like, is it product driven or engineering driven? And those are coded meaning to say like, does engineering have the final say or does product have the final say in how things are driven? And it's really critical to know that, because as you start to think about the impact that you want to have, the conversation starts with these teams. The second thing that you do after you build those strong, authentic relationship and start to understand the business the bottom line and all the boring stuff that we usually don't want to pay attention to. Like, I think it's really cool. For example, at Gusto, like I literally set up meetings with chief financial officer, co-founders to really understand how we work. And then I started to think about what has worked for me in the past in terms of really driving change, what hasn't, what is going to change based on the way Gusto thinks about things. And mind you, this is my very first startup. And so there's a lot of like failing fast. The second thing that I think will be really helpful to save UX is to um, really do the work in understanding that there's going to be a cultural change. Like it's going to be an entire company change when it comes to the way that we want to lead with product and design and the way we do stuff. And one thing that folks are starting to learn, which is a good thing, is just speaking the language of the business. I think that is good, but we should extend that to not just speaking the language of the business, but also speaking the trade-off language of the business. A lot of times we talk about, okay, this new experience is going to generate like revenue or do this and that, but we are not doing a good job talking about what does it take for us to do this. What is a trade-off? And for me, leading research, I'm like, for this to happen, for this great vision that I've set up and this strategic understanding of like how research drives the future of our products, something has to give. What is that? The way we work, the way research sprints ahead of product teams, the way we communicate, the way we get to understand product and design roadmaps, in totality to what research is doing, so we can truly have the insights ready. The way the business cycle works. Like all of these things are conversations that I think we need to have in order for teams that are so passionate and so really careful about the way that they are put in their commitment where they need to in terms of UX to understand the trade-offs and what has to give for the business to get to where we want them to go. So I usually describe it in like DEI at first. Like we all agree that that's good, but we also know it's hard, right? So that conversation is not just like you sign in on a sheet with 20 or 30 other companies saying we pledge to do this and that and that, but what do we have to do? What has to give for us to get there, right? And so that's the analogy that I give all the time about, UX is integral. It's been welcome in a lot of companies, but the true in-depth conversation about what has to give for UX to be effective and to really drive product and engineering decisions, I think it's something that it's hard. And I just started 3 months ago, so we'll see how that gets to in the future. But I'm excited about
Yeah, I
this
think you
too.
hit on a really important point. There can be a big difference between our intentions and our habits. Of course we want
Yes.
diversity and inclusion. We want good UX and good products, but an organization has its history. And even I think with a startup, the people who join that, even there might not be organizational history, they come with their own histories and their own habits. And
Yes.
I guess maybe where have you seen the biggest challenges in breaking through some of those existing behaviors that might run counter to what the organization says that they want, but where they might struggle to actually put it into practice? That wraps up part one of my conversation with Dr. Gloria O.B. Osardu. Tune in next week when you'll hear her say,
really deeply think about trade-offs in terms of like that rigor versus scrappiness, ethical, equitable versus constraints.
Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss that or any future episodes. You can also follow me on Twitter at Sonarc, SONARC, or on LinkedIn. I post show updates on both platforms. You can find more info as well as past episodes at sux.live. That's SUX for savingux.live. Until next time, I'm Jeremy Kriegel, and this has been Saving UX.